One thing I should mention before we start, not a single ounce of research has been done for this vid, like, nada. This is literally just all of things I've observed online and for myself. And this is one of many reasons you should never take me seriously. Now, I'm not exactly an old anime fan, I've been watching it for less than a decade. But even then, I fear I'm going to show what little age I have by asking the following. Did Trigger save anime? While I've been an anime fan, no studio has had more fluctuation in their reputation, try saying that 5 times fast, than Studio Trigger. They've gone from God to Satan then back to God again, several times in a brief period. And this brings up the question of Trigger's identity. And in fairness, if one wonders what type of shoes that Studio Trigger are wearing, just look at the ones they set out to fill. Gainax have a long history, but as a Western anime fan talking about reactions mainly gauged from other Western anime fans, we know one very specific end of that history, 1995 onwards. Now, of course, this era was characterized by some pretty landmark titles such as Evangelion, Die Buster, and Fooly Cooly, but the main article here is Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann. While certainly not the first experience that the staff involved had making anime, it was certainly the first one where they had the most creative control over the final product. And it kicked fucking ass. This was an ode to the mecha series they grew up with, and ironically, this throwback ended up defining the mid-2000s generation of anime, as it was the last hurrah of what some people even consider to be the golden age of anime. The show holds a special place in my heart, and for many reasons, but for me, it's got to be balanced. It knows when to be high octane, but it also knows when to slow down. It knows when to be about action, and it knows when to be about the characters. But Gurren Lagann is a very special mix. In fact, I dare say it's lightning in a bottle. And can our friends at Gainax do it again? No, they can't. Because the year is now 2011, and several people from Gainax, including that fella who did Gurren Lagann, have now left to form a new studio called Studio Trigger. I think I've heard of those guys from somewhere. Now that Studio Trigger was a thing, they needed the world to know about this fact. As a result, they decided to create their first anime. An anime that some of you might have heard of. It wasn't that one. No. The first anime they made was in 2012, and it was this bad boy, a miniseries called Inferno Cop. Now, I struggle to call this an anime since it feels a bit more like an internet historian sponsor read, just with somehow even less animation. But there's also something worth mentioning. It wasn't just Trigger at the helm, since they also had help from Comics Wave Films. You know, the people behind Kimi no fucking Nawa. And I find it quite interesting that the two crossed paths. See, both would go on to have a major release the next year in 2013, both with very, very different atmospheres. Comics Wave Films put out The Garden of Words, a short but ultimately tranquil film. And while the story of it is simple, it's made all the more effective through the methodical pace that is taken through it. Meanwhile, Trigger released Don't Lose Your Way. Kill la Kill exploded onto the scene, and just in case you were wondering what people were comparing this to, the writer was the guy behind Gurren Lagann, the director was the other guy behind Gurren Lagann, and the animation has all the same amount of bombastic energy as Take a Bloody Guess. Now, I like Kill la Kill, not to the same level as Gurren Lagann, but I respect those who have it as one of their favourites. Indeed, many people love Kill la Kill. Now, I have a feeling that the ones who list it among their favourites were probably watching it when it started coming out. You see, Kill la Kill was the spark that lit the will Trigger save anime discussion, because this series kicked a lot of ass and showed a lot of titties, but in a way that you could argue parodies shows that kick a lot of ass and show a lot of titties. But the message was laid out clear from the fans. They wanted Trigger to do that again. They needed them to come out with another original, and they needed it to show the industry what they needed to be doing. They needed Trigger to be leading the pack. And what came next? The point where I come into the story. So my first Trigger anime was in spring 2016, and it was called Kisniver. I got into it because a friend of mine showed me the opening, and it slapped. Now, Kisniver was not only my first Studio Trigger anime, it was also the first anime I'd ever seen written by Mari Okada, same person who did work on Toradora, Makia, etc, etc. And on top of all of this, it was the 8th anime I had ever watched, period. So you can probably understand when I say that I found it completely okay. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it just feels less than the sum of its parts. And even at the time I was wondering, why are so many people hyped about Kisniver? But that was answered when I looked online and saw that no one was talking about this without mentioning how it was a Studio Trigger anime. And I found myself asking, if it weren't for the fact this was by Studio Trigger, would we be talking about this at all? Indeed, Kisniver did not change the world, but it did prove people still had the appetite for Trigger to come and save anime. The next year, Trigger released the Little Witch Academia series based off an OVA they had made a few years ago. And while that got a little closer to the kind of high-octane stuff seen in Kill la Kill, a delayed international release condemned it to the reputation of a good Studio Trigger anime, even though I don't think I've heard anyone saying it's their favourite. The fans were still there, and they were still waiting for anime to be saved. Indeed, Trigger let slip news about a new show they were working on, one that would release in 2018. One that went back to their mecha roots. It was Darling in the Franxx, okay? As someone who's gone on record with how much they didn't watch Darling in the Franxx, I feel I do need to put some prefaces on what I'm about to say. Indeed, this was a collaboration between Studio Trigger and A1 Pictures, so while blaming A1 Pictures is a bit of a meme in regards to Darling in the Franxx, it can be argued the two had an equal hand in it. Secondly, I've heard Darling in the Franxx is actually quite good in its first half, and even some parts of its latter portions. I've heard there's apparently a flashback halfway through, which is really good. On top of this, I am merely hearing that the series ended in a way that was convoluted and confusing, so I don't have a 100% accurate source on this, having not watched it. But having said all that, what the fuck was the ending of Darling in the Franxx? Studio Trigger had gone full Trigger, and while we had indeed wanted them to go full Trigger, we definitely did not need them to go full Trigger. In the Western anime community at least, the jokes were endless, and everyone began to treat the time they spent admiring Studio Trigger like their emo phase. This marked a low point in Studio Trigger's reputation, and I find that a shame because less than half a year after the end of Franxx, Trigger put out something else. SSSS Gridman was largely slept on by the anime community, myself included, but everyone who watched it would not shut up about it. And funnily enough, when they were talking about it, they were able to talk about things other than the fact it was by Studio Trigger. I've done a review of it, but to cut a long story short, SSSS Gridman really impressed me. And while I agree that I doubt I would have gravitated towards it like I did were it not for the big studio name, Trigger doesn't feel like they could be entirely replaceable in the project. Their character design helped the larger-than-life moments stand out from the surprisingly laid-back approach the majority of the piece goes with. SSSS Gridman might have been overlooked, but it proved something. Trigger can do quite well even when they aren't trying to recapture Gurren Lagann. But this would take some more proving. Promare came out the year afterwards, and practically writes the book on over-the-top, fun from start to finish stuff that makes you remember Gurren Lagann. This anime about firefighters, ironically, set the world on fire for a brief period. But while it was clear a lot of the endearment came from the fact it was a celebration of Gurren Lagann and Kill la Kill's legacy, it meant that people began to look up on Studio Trigger again. And all they had to do now was build the rest of their reputation back up the way that they wanted to do it, instead of the way others wanted them to do it. This strategy of doing what they wanted to do instead of doing what they were expected to do came into fruition over the next few years. BNA had their trademark style to it, but it was a much more intimate narrative, and actually looking back on it, I like it a lot more than I did upon its release. Their 10th anniversary project was another SSSS anime, Dynazenon, which was even more focused on the non-tokusatsu parts of the equation than Gridman. And indeed, this felt like training. Trigger getting back on the right stuff, proving they can do shows which don't just have to have the tone of Kill la Kill. All they had to do was have something high profile again. And that's when, in the words of Lil Yachty, they took the work to Poland. So Cyberpunk Edgerunners came out earlier this year, and I say without a shadow of a doubt it is my favourite Studio Trigger show, even more so than the aforementioned Dynazenon. I might have said that the show didn't have much silence in it, but that doesn't mean it isn't introspective. In fact, the slower paced moments actually got people talking as much as the faster paced moments. People realised that Trigger can actually do slower paced stuff really well, and that they aren't just a one-trick pony. It may be by that man who directed Gurren Lagann all those years ago, but they've decided to come at this from a completely new angle, and it feels like a breath of fresh air in their filmography. Now, I've gushed over Edgerunners in a previous vid, and I'm going to gush about it in a future vid, but I want to mention this quote I find very interesting. Mike Pondsmith, upon being asked what attracted him to cyberpunk as a genre, said he likes it because it differs from other sci-fi, as it's not about saving the world. It's about saving yourself. This got me thinking. Edgerunners isn't getting anyone proclaiming that Trigger is saving anime, but it's proven to us that Trigger have saved themselves. Not only does Studio Trigger have their reputation back, but they've gained a new, more formidable one in the modern anime scene. And hopefully, unlike what happened before, they aren't bound by what they did in the past, but instead look towards new things they can do. So I suppose what needs to happen in the future is for Studio Trigger to stay on the path they chose for themselves, and I suppose Don't lose their way, Mum! But seriously, Studio Trigger have proven themselves to be a studio with more than one string to their bow, and I'm really excited to watch their next project, Space. Hopefully instead of watching it go to space.